The proceeding will start shortly. 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 The proceeding will start shortly The proceeding will start shortly. 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 The proceeding will start The proceeding will start shortly. 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 The proceeding will start shortly.
Order, and welcome to this sitting of the Northern Ireland Select Committee, where we're continuing our inquiry into the effectiveness of the institutions of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. And we're very pleased we have two witnesses today. First session will be with the Right Honourable Sir Jeffrey Donaldson, leader of the DUP, and the second session with Naomi Long, MLA, who is leader of the Alliance Party. And so, welcome, Jeffrey. If I could start off the question, it's sort of like the exam question, I suppose, is could you outline briefly to the committee why your party opposed the 1998 settlement and what your position is now with regard to each strand of the agreement and the institutions they created?
Well, thank you, Sir Robert, and thank you to the committee for this opportunity to give evidence on what is clearly a very important subject. I wasn't, of course, a member of the DUP in 1998, so it's difficult for me to speak for the party on that occasion, but I took a similar stance to them on the agreement in opposing it at the time, and I would be fairly familiar with the reasons why the DUP decided not to back the agreement. As you will know, the agreement is multifaceted. And key elements of the agreement relate to what I would call the peace process, and other elements of the agreement relate to the constitutional arrangements for Northern Ireland and the political institutions that were established by the agreement. Many of the concerns that were held by Unionists who opposed the agreement at that time related to the elements linked to the peace process. So, for example, the early release of prisoners, the failure to link that process with the process of decommissioning. In other words, that paramilitary terrorist organisations, if they were going to benefit from aspects of the agreement, should be compelled to honour their obligations, which included the decommissioning of their illegal weapons. And indeed, from 1998 right through to 2005, 6, 7, we saw nothing from the Provisional IRA by way of decommissioning, despite that after 2 years of the agreement, all their prisoners had been released. Similarly with Loyalist paramilitary groups, release of prisoners, but very little by way of progress on decommissioning. There were also elements, and I should also say 2 other things on the peace process side. Firstly, the absolute failure of the agreement to get to terms with and get to grips with the legacy of our troubled past. There was absolutely no proposal in there to give victims the opportunity to pursue truth and justice. It was merely aspirational, nothing by way of institutional arrangements, processes that would enable victims of the Troubles, over 3,000 of them and their families, to have a process they could follow. And when you balance that against the early release of prisoners, you can see how the victims felt that the agreement failed to address their concerns, notwithstanding, of course, that the agreement was about delivering a peaceful outcome for Northern Ireland. And I'm not suggesting that those who were pursuing peace were motivated by a desire to do wrong by the victims, but it was a major failing of the agreement. We also had concerns around the proposals for policing and what that might mean for the reputation of the Royal Ulster Constabulary, a police service that had suffered grievously during the Troubles. And we did not want them to become some kind of a scapegoat in the process of building a more peaceful society in Northern Ireland.
So it wasn't so much the political structures themselves.
Well, I'm coming to that.
It
so
was the whole package.
Yeah. So on the constitutional side and the institutional arrangements, there were concerns that the DUP articulated at that time about some of those arrangements around accountability, for example, at executive level. A concern that ministers could act almost in a solo capacity within their departments, and that there wasn't really a sense of collective responsibility within the executive. We were also concerned that, for example, a party like Sinn Féin, linked to a fully armed group at that time, might have access to ministerial office without actually that armed group standing down and removing their weapons. So, that went to the heart of what is democracy, how should democracy function, and do you corrupt democracy if you place people in ministerial office who are still linked to a fully armed prescribed terrorist organisation. So there were concerns about how the institutions would operate in those circumstances. It's fair to say that many of those concerns were dealt with in the St Andrews Agreement, and of course Sinn Féin eventually were brought to a point where the IRA decommissioned weapons and Sinn Féin signed up to support policing and justice. But that took almost 10 years on from the agreement to achieve those changes. So in summary, Mr Chairman, we did feel there were significant flaws in the agreement. No agreement is ever going to be perfect, but those flaws were so significant that is why, on balance, the decision was taken to not support the agreement at that time.
So far as the north-south arrangements were concerned, I mean, we're probably in a much better place now than we've ever been in terms of relations across the board. I mean, back then, were there concerns that, some of the links in the south, some of the way that maybe some paramilitary groups were maybe not quite as effectively policed south of the border, dare I say?
Well, that had been a concern, of course, during the whole of the period of the Troubles. There were issues around the extradition of terrorist suspects from the Republic of Ireland to the United Kingdom. There were issues around serious failings at times in investigations by the Irish police into incidents that either occurred in their jurisdiction or across the border. I do want to say, though, that there has been a step change in cooperation between the police services on the island on both sides of the border. I think today that cooperation is at the best it's ever been. and I think that we need to acknowledge that. At the time, our concern on policing was not so much what was happening in the Republic of Ireland, it was more what would the potential reform of policing mean for the capacity of the then RUC to deal with an ongoing terrorist threat. Let's not forget that 1998 did not bring terrorism to an end in Northern Ireland. It's still with us today, and we were concerned that any reform process might undermine the capacity of the police to counter that terrorist threat. And of course we desired greater cooperation from the Irish police in that endeavour, and I would say, in truth, that cooperation is more forthcoming today.
Thanks very much indeed. It's interesting, we had evidence from the PSNI recently about the problems they're facing in terms of funding, and some of that seems to stem from the fact there's no functioning executive instalment. So we hope there might be progress there as well. But that wasn't a question, that was just a comment.
I might deal with that later, Mr. Chairman.
Claire Hannah.
Thank you very much. What do you make of the changes to the agreement established at St Andrews, and are any of those that you would wish to alter?
Well, at St Andrews there were a number of changes made, particularly in relation to how the executive functioned at that time. So, for example, one of the key changes was a requirement that ministers would bring all major decisions to the executive for approval. And I think that has helped to enhance a degree of collective responsibility. We're still some way off what a proper collective responsibility type executive might be, but there were improvements made as a result of changes at St Andrews. Allied to the eventual devolution of policing and justice powers, there was also a new requirement in the pledge of office that a minister would support the police, and that was very important as well to secure that commitment. There was also, in terms of accountability, new measures to ensure that North-South cooperation and decisions taken in the context of the North-South Ministerial Council would be accountable to the executive. I'm not sure, I mean, in terms of, there was a subsequent change made in the legislation which isn't actually included in the text of the St Andrews Agreement, which relates to how the First Minister and Deputy First Minister are elected. It has often been said by some of our opponents that this was a change secured by the DUP at St Andrews. I was part of the DUP negotiating team. I was not at any time, and I attended most of the meetings in which the DUP were involved, bilateral and multilateral meetings. That was not something the DUP pursued at St Andrews. It was not discussed in my presence at any meetings. It was the result of an amendment that the government brought forward during the passage of the St Andrews Agreement Bill in the House of Commons. And we know that it continues to this day to be a matter of controversy in Northern Ireland. But no, I don't. I think that St Andrews represented significant progress as far as we were concerned. It helped to repair or to deal with many of the flaws that we had identified in the original Belfast Agreement.
Many would characterise it as logjam in terms of the veto within the executive, but it is interesting that you're saying it isn't a DUP request, the change to First Ministers. You said in the Spotlight programme in 2019 that it's wholly undemocratic, that one party can veto the mechanisms of government. Is that still your view?
Well, look, it is my view that we need to move to a situation, Claire, in the future where hopefully we can have a greater normalisation of politics in Northern Ireland. That has consistently been the DUP's position. And it was with great reluctance that I took the decision in February 2022 to withdraw the First Minister. I felt it was a proportionate decision that would buy time to allow for negotiation to take place whilst all the departmental ministers remained in place, albeit the executive itself couldn't meet, but at least there were ministers in post, and that enabled a degree of decision making within government departments. So I was hoping, Claire, that within that period that we would see meaningful engagement and negotiation leading to solutions in terms of the concerns that Unionists have about the agreement. But I would say this, Mr. Chairman, I think this is, for me anyway, a fundamental point. And what I'm about to say is not something I'm simply saying for the purposes of making an argument to this committee. Claire will be aware that in the past I have praised her former party leader, John Hume, as being the architect of the process in terms of the three-stranded approach and so on to the agreement. And at the heart of that process, John Hume recognised that in a divided society like Northern Ireland, and he said this many times, it was part of what became known as his single transferable speech, that you cannot operate on majority rule. You've got to operate on the basis of consensus. And John Hume championed the concept of consensus. And the reality is that at the moment in Northern Ireland, that cross-community consensus in relation to some very fundamental issues that impact on the day-to-day lives of the people of Northern Ireland arising from the Northern Ireland Protocol as part of the EU withdrawal agreement means that that consensus has been seriously undermined. Now, we sought to resolve those issues whilst an executive remained in place. We were party to the New Decade New Approach Agreement at the beginning of 2020. We worked in good faith, and part of that agreement, a key commitment in that agreement, was an undertaking by the United Kingdom government to ensure that our place in the internal market of the United Kingdom would be protected in any post-Brexit arrangements. The protocol doesn't do that. And it is now acknowledged by the government and indeed by the Irish Prime Minister, the current Taoiseach, that the protocol actually harmed our ability to trade with the rest of the United Kingdom.
Can you outline times that you operated or demonstrated that principle of consent and consensus in the early years of the Brexit negotiation, and how the DUP attempted to create a solution that would be acceptable to the broad cross-community view in Northern Ireland? And can you outline what your proposed legislative fix would be to allow us to get back to basic governance?
Well, first of all, even as early as the summer of 2016, within weeks after the Brexit referendum vote, when the United Kingdom voted in the largest ever democratic exercise in the history of this nation to leave the European Union, the then First Minister, Arlene Foster, and the Deputy First Minister, the late Martin McGuinness, sent a letter, a joint letter, to both the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom and to the Taoiseach, making clear that in the context of negotiating our exit from the European Union, cognizance would need to be given to the distinct situation that Northern Ireland finds itself in. So even from that moment, Claire, we recognised that we...
ways that you did
well,
that?
I will come to that, but I don't want...
And in terms of the power that your party had during the confidence and supply period, how it attempted to represent and give honour to consent and consensus?
Of course, I will come to that, but I do not want the committee to think that our reference point, our starting point in all of this was just to get Brexit done come what may. We recognised and consistently throughout the period from 2016 worked with the UK government on the basis that we needed to, we recognised there could not be a hard border on the island. We have said that very clearly. So any solution doesn't involve a hard border on the island. But here's the problem, Mr. Chairman. We took that approach because we recognised that a hard border on the island would fundamentally undermine nationalism's confidence in the political institutions and the arrangements that flowed from the agreement. But there are two sides to this coin. And the other side of the coin is that a border in the Irish Sea does exactly that for unionism. It undermines our confidence in the agreement, in how Northern Ireland operates and functions as part of the United Kingdom. It, in our opinion, others disagree, but in our opinion, it undermined the principle of consent. The late Lord Trimble made that absolutely clear in his view. So we've ended up with a situation where in our desire, unionism's desire, the UK government's desire to ensure that nationalism wasn't put offside by post-Brexit arrangements, unionism in fact has been put offside in that sense. Now what we're looking for is a landing zone that restores the consensus. So what does that look like? Well, I believe it looks like this. Where goods are moving from Great Britain via Northern Ireland to the European Union, there should be checks. And we should ensure that those goods comply with EU regulations, we, the United Kingdom, to avoid a hard border. But where goods are moving within the United Kingdom and staying within the United Kingdom, then those goods should flow freely because they do not present a threat to the EU. Any risk is minimal to the European Union, and therefore I think a sense of proportion is needed. And that's why, Mr. Chairman, our concerns around the protocol, and indeed for that matter on the Windsor framework, is to ensure that whilst we have arrangements that keep an open border on the island, that allow businesses in Northern Ireland to trade into the single market, that we don't allow those arrangements to then get in the way of inhibiting our ability to sell our goods in our biggest market, which is actually the United Kingdom. £77 billion worth of goods we manufacture each year in Northern Ireland. Those are the figures from the Statistics Agency. And of those, 65 billion are sold in the United Kingdom. 65 out of 77, £8 billion worth of goods are sold to the EU. What we need is a sense of proportion and balance so that we get back to the consensus. And I believe the principle I've outlined, that where goods are staying in the United Kingdom, they should flow freely. Where they're moving to the EU, we take responsibility for checking.
I hope you would agree with me that the business community who have engaged in detail in this in many years also have a sense of proportion and perspective. Do you think they and the succession of public servants and civil servants and voluntary actors and business voices and policing and others who have sat where you're sitting now talking to us about their hopes and what they need in terms of legislation and reform and funding, will they take any hope or comfort from seeing you giving a speech yesterday to the ERG about rehashed proposals on mutual enforcement which bear no relation to what the business community are saying is plausible or necessary for Northern Ireland? Does that give people the hope that they will need to get through a very, very difficult summer?
Well, Claire, you could do worse than read the article today in today's newspaper, Northern Ireland. I think it's in the Belfast Telegraph, might be the newsletter, from Peter Somerton, who's a businessman, who is an expert on logistics, and who has endorsed the concept of mutual enforcement as a long-term solution. Look, Claire, I'm not saying that mutual enforcement is going to become the solution today or tomorrow. I wish that it would, because I think it does offer an outcome that both the EU and the UK can work with and would resolve many of the problems that I've identified. But we have the Windsor framework, which is due to come into force in October this year. We have put proposals to the government around the concerns we have.
Those proposals so that people can understand what the barriers are. I understand there's a paper. Will you publish that?
We have put that paper to the government. We want to give the government time to respond to that, and I think it's important we respect the integrity of that process. We'll see what the government responds with, and then we can determine what we say publicly. Obviously, the outcome of this process will become a matter of public record. It has to, but I want to ensure that we get the right outcome. And I would say this, Mr. Chairman. When it comes to the business community, we were the only party that took the time to set up a consultation panel that spent countless hours out and about across Northern Ireland, meeting large businesses, small businesses, self-employed people from right across the business community, listening to their views and concerns in relation to the proposals in the Windsor framework. And I can say to you, Claire, that a large element of our proposals reflect what we heard from business around their concerns about how the Windsor framework would work in practice. We're looking for greater clarity around some of that. We're looking for protection for the ability of Northern Ireland's businesses to trade with the rest of the UK in the event, Claire, that there is future divergence between UK law and EU law. And I don't think it's unreasonable to say to the United Kingdom government, look, in relation to the movement of goods within your internal market, not with the EU, I'm not talking about trade with the EU, I'm talking about goods moving inside the United Kingdom, I don't think it's unreasonable to say to the government of the United Kingdom, we need to ensure that where divergence may occur in the future between EU law, which applies to the manufacture of goods in Northern Ireland, and UK law, that the government will ensure that we can continue to have access to the internal market of the United Kingdom, and that changes to either UK law or EU law will not inhibit our ability to trade within our own country. That, in essence, is what we're looking for.
I think having engaged with businesses that 7 years since and before the referendum of a fair handle on what they're asking for, in terms of consent and consensus, is it the case that the DUP are seeking to resile from the principle of consent that's contained in the agreement and the principle that our constitutional status is determined by a simple majority of people voting in Northern Ireland?
No.
That's not the DUP policy.
The DUP's position is very clear. We believe in the principle of consent. But Claire, our interpretation of the principle of consent is not a narrow concept.
No,
as the late Lord Trimble said, consent shouldn't just apply to the final ultimate question as to whether you want to remain in the United Kingdom or not. The principle of consent should ensure that for as long as that is the democratic wish of a majority of the people in Northern Ireland, then that should be reflected in the arrangements for Northern Ireland as part of the United Kingdom, notwithstanding that we want to have a good relationship with the rest of the island and through the North-South Ministerial Council to cooperate and to share where we can in joint endeavours. But in relation to the principle of consent, our dispute on the principle of consent is that some seek to interpret it in a very narrow way. There will always be a debate, Claire, around if in the future there's a border poll, what the conditions should be for that border poll, how that should be measured. And I do have some sympathy, I might say, with the comments of the late Seamus Mallon. So it's not just DUP members who contribute to this debate. The late Seamus Mallon was very clear. He felt it would be unhealthy and it would be wrong to proceed to create a united Ireland on the basis of a 50+1 majority in a referendum. So look, this is a debate within society. Let it go forward. But we have endorsed and accepted the principle of consent as it is. If it wants to change in the future, if it needs to change in the future, it would have to be by consensus, Claire. I can't, on the one hand, argue for consensus here on some things and then not apply the principle of consensus on others.
I think in the interest of time, I think we probably need to move on because we've only got that.
And I recommend you read the whole book, Jeffrey, and not just that chapter. And I will take that as confirmation that there won't be party support for any legislative efforts here to repeal that or to put in a supermajority.
The UP policy has not changed on this.
I believe you're very genuine in your desire to maintain the union. Do you accept that the DUP effectively telling nationalists and others that devolution within the UK is no longer available? Do you accept that that is accelerating the desire for constitutional change if we can't have the Strand 1 institutions in a devolved setting?
Well, Claire, I want to have the Strand 1 institutions up and running. I believe fundamentally that power sharing and government by consensus is the way forward in Northern Ireland. And I am working, I can assure you, every day to resolve the problems that have given rise to the undermining of that consensus so that we can rebuild it. And therefore, I am not reviewing this as a long-term outcome. I want to see devolution back. I want to see the Assembly fully functioning and doing its job even better than before. I want to see an executive that works. And maybe we can improve that too in the future. So to be absolutely clear, and let me also, whilst
you do need to make a bit of progress.
I do. Whilst Claire has given me the opportunity, let me be absolutely clear. There are some who allege that the DUP's reluctance to go back into power sharing is because of the way in which the First Minister and Deputy First Minister will operate going forward. They are joint offices. When devolution returns, we will nominate a minister to that office. We are very clear about that. That is not the issue for us. So let me just put that on the record.
Yeah. So much.
Thank you, Jeffrey, and thank you, Chair.
We need to make a bit faster progress if we can. So I'll ask for short, punchy questions and hopefully short, punchy answers as well. Jim.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And Jeffrey, always nice to see you and in a capacity, and also to thank you for your leadership that there is for not just for unionism but for all of the people of the province, which you quite clearly give. DUP obviously had some concerns with the 1998 agreement. They moved on to the St Andrews in 2006. And improvements were made. In that agreement of 2006, was there anything that perhaps we as a party could see being done better to enable the democratic institutions in Northern Ireland to work better? That's the first question.
Well, Jim, we've never been against reform of the institutions, and we have indicated in the past that we are willing to look at further reform in the future. I think the timing of that is very important, and if I'm honest, I mean, there are some, and no doubt we might hear from Mr Farry in due course. The Alliance Party obviously has a very clear view that reform should happen and happen now. My view is that we need to get the institutions back up and running. We need to have a basis on which that can happen, hopefully soon. And once we've done that, I think we're into a period of consolidation. There is a lot of reform that is required to our public services before we start thinking about reform to our political institutions. And frankly, my priority in those circumstances will be reforming the health service, ensuring that our schools continue to deliver the best form of education in the United Kingdom, and growing our economy, building the prosperity agenda for everyone in Northern Ireland. So yes, reform is important, but I think reform of the political institutions does not trump reform of our public services.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think the importance of health and education, roads, and all the other ones, fishing and farming as well, I think those are really critical issues. And just to take this a bit further in relation to where we are in the Assembly and the process, when we look forward, DUP obviously speak for the majority of Unionists. Also, while other parties might have a different shade of unionism, the issue for the Stormont break and the Windsor Agreement, as it was put forward quite clearly as united unionism in its opposition. I suppose the question that I really want to ask is, what would you like to see in the process moving forward, and what needs to be done to make the Northern Ireland Assembly workable, not just for unionists, because you can't ignore them. And I know, and the Chair knows as well, that both Tony Blair and Bertie Ahern made it clear that this agreement couldn't work without the input of unionism, and therefore it would never happen. So if we're going to find a way of going forward, I'm just wondering what way you would see that working.
Well, if that relates to political institutions, Jim, then look, the first thing we need to do, in my priority right now, Sir Robert, is to ensure that we have the conditions for the restoration of devolution as quickly as possible. And I've given some indication to Claire as to what that might look like. In terms of going forward, I think that what we need to is get down to business. I would like to see, and I think the big challenge that's going to face the incoming executive is reform of our public services. And alongside that, of course, we have the current budgetary pressures. And I am glad to say, Sir Robert, that despite some who don't recognise this, the four parties that will form the executive are meeting every week at the moment. They're meeting with senior civil servants. They're examining where the budgetary pressures are. They're putting together proposals that we hope to take to the Treasury. They are looking at what the priorities are for reform of our public services. And they're looking at what the main elements of a programme for government might be for an incoming executive, which of course will have to go through a formal process once an executive is formed. So preparatory work is already happening, Jim. Now that is without prejudice to, I am not saying that means the restoration of devolution in the short term is inevitable. A lot depends on how the government respond to the proposals we have put forward, which we believe are fair and reasonable and balanced and will help to restore the consensus that is essential for the institutions to operate effectively. So I think reform of our institutions has to take second place to our budgetary pressures and resolving those in the short term, and then reforming our public services. But going forward, I think we do want to see a greater normalisation of politics in Northern Ireland. We do need to look at the voting mechanisms within the Assembly. We do need to look at how an executive is formed in the future. We will go into any discussions with the other parties on that with a view to getting agreement, consensus on how we take this forward. And
the final point, Mr. Chairman, is in relation to the the document launched yesterday, mutual enforcement that you referred to. And my thoughts, Sir Jeffrey, are that the mutual enforcement document offers a way forward, not just for unionism, but for the whole of Northern Ireland to have a working relationship within that. But perhaps maybe, if you don't mind, you could maybe just set out what the mutual enforcement offers for everyone in Northern Ireland.
Well, very briefly, Sir Robert, what it would entail is that the European Union and the United Kingdom would come to an arrangement whereby where EU goods are coming into the United Kingdom, the EU would ensure that those goods comply with UK rules, and equally where UK goods are moving into the single market, the UK government would take responsibility for ensuring those goods comply with EU rules. That's a very short summary, Jim, of what it means. I think it would do away with a lot of the bureaucracy and fundamentally and importantly a lot of the cost. I mean, let's not forget that in the first year of the operation of the Trusted Trader scheme for set up under the protocol, it cost £350 million. You think what you could do with £350 million in terms of driving down waiting lists in the health service in Northern Ireland. So, you know, that's why it benefits everybody to simplify the process as much as we can. But it requires a building of trust between the UK and the EU for the system to work effectively, and I hope we can get to that place.
And the thing, the issue really, Sir Jeffrey, is quite simply, and it is a simple system, and it can work. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Robin Walker.
Thank you. So Jeffrey, we've heard, you talked about the importance of building consensus and working together. We've heard quite a lot of evidence during the course of this inquiry from former senior civil servants that the checks and balances built into the design of the institutions have made it quite difficult to pursue policies which would be routinely agreed in other jurisdictions. Do you think there's something to be done about that? And do you think, when you're talking about particularly, I think, a focus on delivery of public services, there is more that could be done to normalise perhaps the working of the institutions?
Well, look, we favour normalisation, Robin, and I can understand you were a minister in the Northern Ireland office. And I'm not faulting the civil service here. The Northern Ireland Civil Service operated for many years under a system of direct rule, with were effectively maybe 1 or 2 day a week ministers arriving in Northern Ireland, sitting at their desks, signing lots of documents, which I'm sure they scrutinised very closely. But let's be honest about it. It was hardly the most accountable form of democracy in the world. And they went from that to having one of the most complex forms of democracy in the world in the form of Northern Ireland's power sharing. And I think a lot of those safety valves and safety nets were important to build confidence in the first period of the operation of those political institutions. But I hold an aspiration that as our society changes, and it is changing, as people develop their political perspectives, and as we build a degree of trust in how government works here, that we can begin to let go of some of the crutches, and that we move to a more normalised process. I'm going to be very frank here, Sir Robert. And I was had the pleasure of serving in the Assembly and the Executive for a period of time as a junior minister in the First Minister and Deputy First Minister's office, and saw up close how that office works. Sinn Féin is not a normal political party, does not function like a normal political party. And I can assure you the frustration of civil servants in Northern Ireland is one that is shared by Sinn Féin's partners in the Executive. Very often in what is now the Executive Office, when decisions would come forward, which of course in the Executive Office required joint approval, Sinn Féin would take those issues away, sometimes for weeks, sometimes for months. I don't know who they were going to consult or where that consultation took place, but it was very frustrating, not just for civil servants, but for DUP ministers, that some important decisions were constantly delayed. And of course, I mean, there may have been occasions when we had concerns. and where we had to take our time about making decisions. And I think there is a balance to be struck here, Robin, between what is reasonable in terms of a length of period of time. And we've actually been discussing this amongst the political parties. Should we, for example, bringing reports to the executive from ministers, bringing papers to the executive, should we look at timetabling some of that work? It's not easy, but I would like Sir Robert to be in a position in the future where ministers can't hold up indefinitely decisions that need to be taken. Of course, ministers can have genuine concerns, but there are mechanisms within the executive to deal with that. So maybe we need to simplify it to a degree. We will not be able to remove all of those safeguards.
But in terms of safeguards, obviously the mechanisms for effectively a veto going forward are one of those. It's also the principle of cross-community consent, which we all understand is hugely important, but the nature of the communities has evolved. And you know, we have many more people now not designating in Northern Ireland. Do you think there is scope for reform to reflect that and to make sure that you don't effectively have a third group which is denied the same rights as nationalists or unionists?
Well, actually, whilst we will still need to retain the principle of cross-community consent, because I think that's important, that's the basis for power sharing. And I would not subscribe to a view that says in the future you could have a power sharing executive that excluded people. But you know, maybe towards in the future looking at the concept of voluntary coalition, but it would still require some kind of cross-community test, in my opinion, for the good of everyone in Northern Ireland. But I do think we should look at the voting mechanisms. And in terms of how the Assembly operates, we have suggested in the past you could look at some kind of weighted majority vote system that is not necessarily based on designation, but based on members in the Assembly, which would still have a cross-community element to it because of the nature of the weight of the vote required. But let's not forget that for many votes in the Assembly, it's a simple majority vote. Mm-hmm. You know, there is this notion that everything the Assembly does has to be by cross-community consent. It's only certain areas of law and policy that come under, you know, what is deemed to be sensitive or controversial, where that cross-community consent mechanism kicks in. So, look, we're up for conversations around that, but I go back to the point I made to the member for Strangford that, you know, we need to have a sense of priority here. Let's get back to the executive when we can, when we resolve the outstanding issues, and then let's show that devolution can deliver for people. In the end, the public is less interested in how we do it. What they are interested in is the outcomes, what it means for them, what difference it makes to their lives.
Absolutely, and the public are very keen, obviously, to have working devolved institutions up and running as much as possible. Do you think there's enough of an incentive for parties to stay in those institutions? And we had some of our witnesses talked about the jeopardy situation. I think Claire quoted you back on a previous iteration when Jim Fain walked out of the executive, the frustration that causes. Is there enough carrot, as well as we've debated stick and cutting pay and all that kind of thing, but is there enough carrot there to say actually it is worthwhile for the major parties who represent very substantial parts of their community to be in the institutions?
Well, Robin, I hope I've been around politics in Northern Ireland long enough to have formed the view that the vast majority of people who stand for election in Northern Ireland want to get things done. And they want to work the institutions in a way that delivers for the people they represent. Because actually, you know, in my experience as an MP of 26 years is that delivering for your people is the best way of winning elections and actually securing the votes of people. It's not to leave them feeling frustrated. Although, you know, in fairness, as has been said by the member for Strangford, you know, where we are at the moment, we believe we have a mandate for the course of action we've taken. We've had 2 elections and a very clear majority in unionism has backed the stance we've taken. But that stance is about getting this sorted out. It's not about, it is not a long-term strategy to frustrate the political institutions or to deny the people of Northern Ireland a functioning government. So I believe that that all parties in the executive ultimately are there because they want to deliver for the people they represent, albeit we have different aspirations in terms of the long-term future of Northern Ireland.
So, you think we've had too often a situation where some issues which are relatively unimportant compared to education, health and policing, such as, say, flying of flags or Irish language, are sort of given undue political prominence as a way of sort of becoming a sort of roadblock to progress in other areas?
Look, there is no doubt that our constitutional arrangements are important to everyone in Northern Ireland. Well, many in Northern Ireland, maybe not everyone, but many people in Northern Ireland have a view on Northern Ireland's constitutional future. And in those circumstances, when issues arise that raise a question mark for people about what they felt was a settled position under the agreement being disrupted, then that does give rise to public debate and has. And I hope we can get back to a place where, of course, we continue to discuss those constitutional arrangements and we've always said, provided people pursue their aspirations by peaceful means alone, then that is a valid political engagement. But fundamentally, for most people in Northern Ireland, in my experience, on a day-to-day basis, what matters to them is that mum can get her surgery, that someone is going on diagnosed with cancer, that the kids have access to good education, that there's the prospect of jobs for our young people so that they don't leave Northern Ireland, that people can put bread on the table. I am not for one moment suggesting that those matters are less important. They are absolutely important to every household in Northern Ireland, but our politics is also to a degree shaped by our attitudes towards the constitutional future of Northern Ireland.
Thanks, Sir Jeffrey. Stephen Farry.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Sir Jeffrey. You mentioned just there that the current withdrawal from the executive is not a long-term strategy. But it is now 16 months on since you removed the First Minister, so it is becoming, shall we say, fairly deeply embedded. And you've just talked there about the various priorities that people have. No doubt, you're hearing the same voices that we are hearing, in that if you look at the business community, they want the executive back. If you listen to trade unions, they want the executive back. You listen to every professional in the health service, they say they want the executive back. The community volunteer sector, same. I can go on and on in that particular regard. Do you see that there is a danger in what you're framing around the Protocol Windsor framework issues, that they're, in your view, being put on a greater pedestal than those issues you talk about on a daily basis about health service and education that you're hearing?
No, I don't, Stephen, because aspects of the Windsor framework and the protocol impact on these issues, and we know there have been problems with access to medicines, for example. Veterinary medicines is another issue that remains unresolved, and that's important to our agri-food sector, which is our biggest sector, providing employment for tens of thousands of people in Northern Ireland. It's their livelihood. So resolving these issues is important, and I'm not in the business of grading them what's more important than anything else. What I'm saying is that Stormont functions when there is a cross-community consensus, and I would have hoped the Alliance Party, a party that has prided itself on the support for cross-community politics in Northern Ireland, would understand this, that without that consensus, and the protocol cut so deep for unionism that we held on, and we urged the government to do something about it, to go beyond just extending grace periods. They did publish a command paper way back in July 2021 that offered the prospect, Sir Robert, of progress being made. So I held on. Indeed, I remember standing on the green out here being goaded by the Clare's party leader as the boy who cried wolf, that I said I was going to act on the executive and hadn't. The reason was because I tried to give as much time as possible, right through to February 2022, for action to be taken, for some process to get underway, and nothing happened. Nothing happened. And it was only after I took that decision that then finally some months later, the EU and the UK government got round the table and began a serious negotiation around these issues. Now, some progress has been made, Stephen, in relation to the Windsor framework. There are areas of concern that we have that relate to the operation of the internal market of the UK. I believe that what we're asking for is reasonable. I don't believe for one moment that what we're asking for would be offensive to anybody else. It's simply about the ability of our businesses to trade in our biggest market, and that is future-proof, that is protected going forward if there's change to EU law or UK law. So I don't think that's unreasonable, and that's important because it will be our ministers, yours, ours, who will be in the executive overseeing any new arrangements that are put in place. And I want to be sure that they operate as effectively as possible. The last thing I want, Sir Robert, is another crisis in 6 months or a year's time. That's why I want the foundations to be strong.
And we will give a fair hearing to anything along those lines, but I would have to make the point that most people think those issues can be resolved alongside a sitting executive.
We tried that, Stephen. We tried that.
The scale of what you're talking about around veterinary medicines and medicine flows and other issues, for many, pale insignificance compared to the other side.
They're only examples.
Maybe to frame this in a different way, Sir Jeffrey, I mean, you approach your politics as a unionist. That is a defining issue for you as a politician. Some people would argue that in terms of trying to save the union in your own terms, you're actually killing the union, because what other people say is that the union is based upon consent, it's based upon a working assembly and other institutions, it's based upon equality and inclusion in Northern Ireland, and people are saying none of that. And do you not see that your current approach and tactics are actually eroding support for the union?
Well, I would argue very strongly, Stephen, that my approach is to ensure that the union is what it says. Let me just make this point, Chairman. It is utterly ridiculous that in the first year of the operation of the Northern Ireland Protocol, we had tens of thousands of customs declarations being made on goods travelling from one part of the United Kingdom to another, which cost businesses in Northern Ireland millions of pounds. Cost the UK government £350 million just to support those businesses with that process. Is that how I see the union? As a unionist, I believe that the way the union should function is that when you move goods from London to Belfast, that you've got to make a customs declaration, that you've got to pay fees to move those goods within the United Kingdom, that you've got to have millions of pounds of public money spent on supporting businesses to operate a system that shouldn't be necessary. So, look, maybe you and I view the union differently, but Article 6 of the Acts of Union infers on the people of Northern Ireland certain economic rights. Those rights should be respected. And they were undermined by the protocol because Article 6 says we have the right, there should be no barriers to trade between the constituent parts of the United Kingdom. The protocol put barriers in place. It created a border in the Irish Sea. And you would, I think, quite rightly argue that if we'd put a land border on the island, that would be offensive to nationalists. And I don't understand why you don't understand that your unionist constituents in North Down who talk to me find it offensive that there's a border in the Irish Sea and that for them undermines the union. That's not the union that they voted for, supported or gave their consent to.
I would say my voters
across, I mean, some of that due to maybe overzealous application of the at-risk criterion, because we all thought, oh great, if it's not at risk it won't be a problem, but lots of things seem to be deemed at risk even though they weren't.
I think it's more than that, Sir Robert, and the current Taoiseach accepted, and I will quote his words, that the EU overreached in terms of the arrangements that were put in place under the protocol, that some of it they accept was not necessary. So it's not about the zealous implementation of the protocol arrangements, it's that the protocol itself went too far. And there were arrangements put in place that frankly were not necessary. Of all the trade that crosses EU borders around the whole of the single market, it's what, 0.05% of all trade crosses the Irish border. The risk to the EU is minimal, and yet the solution is a maximalist approach. And I've described it before as a sledgehammer to crack a nut. We need to get a sense of proportion and balance here.
Yes. Sorry, Stephen.
Just to stress a couple of things. I mean, obviously the Windsor framework has been agreed by Parliament, and the scope for any further clarification or reassurance has to be seen in those tram lines that exist, in the sense that you can't reopen that negotiation with the European Union as such. But just moving on back to reform in institutions, most of the questions have been asked around reform, including the formation of executive and with a majority and designations. But can I just ask you, Sir Jeffrey, just to clarify, at present you are resisting the notion of a different form of government being set up to give those who wish of us to govern the chance to do so. But can you just state for the record, I mean, your party has advocated a voluntary coalition over the past 20 years. It's been in your manifestos consistently for the past 20 years, as it has been in ours. Why is that not your policy today? Is it simply a reflection of the conditions not suiting, as opposed to being something that is a matter of principle to the party?
Well, Stephen, there is a difference between a solution to the problems around the Northern Ireland Protocol and a solution to how we do things better within a functioning Northern Ireland executive. If you're saying that in order to restore Stormont, let's exclude the Unionists who are concerned about the protocol and that will offer the solution, frankly, Stephen, that's not real world politics. No, excluding people, ignoring their concerns, we have seen time and time again, it doesn't offer the best way forward for Northern Ireland. Yes, let's get the institutions back up and running. Let's get the progress we need, and I hope that progress will come soon. Let's get the institutions restored. Let's get on with the process of reforming our public services, delivering for our people. And in that context, we can also look at having that conversation around what reform of the institutions will look like. And yes, you're right, Stephen. We remain committed to the greater normalisation of politics going forward. But for goodness sake, let's not go down the road of the politics of exclusion. Let's go down the road of the politics of consensus. Voluntary coalition implies still the need for consensus.
People would argue, through your own approach at the moment, you're excluding 75% of the population who do want to see the executive and the assembly.
Well, Stephen, I didn't make the rules, nor did I vote for them in 1998. With respect, Alliance did. Alliance signed up to an agreement that created those rules, voted for that agreement, accepted the rules, and you can't now complain when those rules are the basis for the actions that we have taken. I'm sorry, but that doesn't work. The rules are there. They operate as they are, and until in the future there is a consensus, and it should be a consensus, I hope the Alliance Party is not suggesting that we do reform by way of majority rule, because the Alliance Party has prided itself in all of its existence at resisting the notion of majority rule.
We would love to have power sharing, including all parties at the moment, but at the moment,
let's work towards that.
Sadly, it's not happening at the moment, but I'll pass back to the Chair. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Stephen. We've got three more questions, and we're going to eat into the second panel time, so it could be brief questions and, if possible, brief answers. Carl Lockhart.
Thank you, Sir Robert, and thank you, Sir Jeffrey, for your comments so far. Just a couple of quick points. You make a very valid point about the fact that it was your leadership that actually brought about some of the positive changes within the Windsor framework. In terms of any debate that has happened in this House in relation to the protocol and the limited debate around the Windsor framework, it has been said that the arrangements are needed to protect the integrity of the Belfast Agreement, and I know that you share my views that that actually is not what the protocol of the Windsor framework does. It's actually the opposite. Would you like to just take this opportunity to reiterate to the committee why this is the case? Also, when you speak of the protocol in the Windsor framework, Stephen raised earlier about the scale that he minimised the impact on medicines. Can you just outline some of the key major issues for businesses, particularly I think of manufacturing, for instance, in my own constituency, huge industry, huge employer in Northern Ireland. Can you just reiterate to this committee the problems that these industries are facing and will continue to face under the Windsor framework?
Well, of course, the objective in the negotiations, we felt, between the UK government and the EU was to put in place new arrangements that would respect both the integrity of the EU single market and the integrity of the United Kingdom's internal market. I think the Windsor Framework takes us some way in that direction, but not all of the way. And it remains for me, I think, I have real difficulty with the notion that when we sell a minority of our goods, manufactured goods to the European Union, that there is still this requirement that all goods manufactured in Northern Ireland must be subject to EU law, despite the fact that the vast majority of those goods are not sold to the EU. And that has major implications, even under the Windsor Framework. It could mean in the future that as EU law changes, you will get divergence between the laws that apply to the manufacture of goods in Northern Ireland and the laws that apply to the manufacture of goods in our biggest market, which is Great Britain. Equally, and perhaps even more potentially greater threat, is that as UK law changes in the future, because I imagine that the EU law change will be evolutionary, whereas a United Kingdom outside the European Union is going to look, as we have seen in REUL, is going to look to regulatory reform perhaps on a bigger scale. Where regulations in the United Kingdom change and vary from that which apply under EU law, if EU law covers the over 300 areas of law that still apply in Northern Ireland, if the change in the UK impacts on that law in Northern Ireland, then it can't, the UK change can't apply to Northern Ireland because EU law exists. So that creates the potential in the future for not only divergence because of change to EU law, but divergence because of change to UK law. That could impact on the ability of our businesses to sell their goods competitively in Great Britain, our biggest market. And that's a real concern for businesses. I've had many businesses in Northern Ireland who've said to me, look, we sell very few goods to the EU, but we sell a lot of goods to England, Scotland and Wales. And we're really worried what this will mean in the future if this divergence takes place. That's why, Sir Robert, what I'm looking for the government to do is to ensure in law that there's a duty on the government where UK law changes in the future, that it takes account of the arrangements for Northern Ireland and does not prevent Northern Ireland businesses selling their goods competitively in Great Britain. Now, we've got this so-called storm and break, which applies only to changes to EU law, and it remains to be seen how effective that break will be. But that break does not apply to changes to UK law, and that's why we need a system that protects business. In terms of the practical outworkings of the protocol, you will be familiar, and indeed you and I have visited businesses in your constituency, agri-food businesses where they find it difficult, for example, access to seed potatoes for some of your potato growers and merchants in the Upper Band constituency, horticulture businesses, even under the Windsor Framework. There are still certain species of plant and tree that are excluded. So you can't bring trees from Great Britain into Northern Ireland. There's an exclusion there. I also have a concern, and let me just very briefly put this on the record, Sir Robert. The UK government recently published a consultation on the future border operating model for the United Kingdom. And I worry what might happen, for example, in the future if we have some kind of outbreak of bird flu or any avian-based or animal-based disease. That Great Britain will lock down and Northern Ireland will be left outside of that regime in terms of controlling movement and so on. And that has serious consequences. Northern Ireland feeds 5.5 million Britons every year. We box way above our weight. We help the United Kingdom to deliver food security for all the people of the United Kingdom. So, it's not just how the Windsor Framework works, but it's the implications the Windsor Framework has for future UK policy, even, for example, on controlling disease within the United Kingdom in its entirety.
And Sir Robert, just
very briefly,
very briefly, we've MPs and MLAs continually saying that the train is leaving the station without the DUP. Given that the DUP represent over 60% of unionists in the Assembly, how damaging is this, and actually would you say that it's actually dangerous?
Well, the first thing I would want to say, Sir Robert, is that there is no unionist elected to the Northern Ireland Assembly that supports the protocol. The Ulster Unionist Party, to their credit, share many of the concerns we have about the Windsor framework. There is a difference of opinion on how best to deal with that. The Ulster Unionist Party's view is you should go back to Stormont and continue to battle within Stormont for further change. My view is better to try and resolve these issues now before Stormont is restored, so that you restore Stormont on a sound foundation and we don't then get into squabbling around how this works or that works. So there's a difference of opinion to a degree on tactics, but unionism is broadly united in its view that the idea of an Irish sea border is harmful to the union. And I think, therefore, it's important, and it goes back to what I said in response to both Claire and Stephen, that if we're going to move Northern Ireland forward on a stable basis, then these concerns need to be addressed properly so that our institutions can function again on the basis of that cross-community consensus.
Okay, thank you very much. I've got two more questions, and I'm going to pull stumps at 10:40 to be fair to Naomi. So, two quick questions and quick answers, I hope, Sir Jeffrey, from Robin Walker.
Just a very quick one. You mentioned earlier about concerns in the early days about the accountability of the North-South Ministerial Council. Do you feel that those have been addressed, and what is the DUP's position now in terms of the role of that council in facilitating cooperation between the executive and the Irish government?
I'm glad, Sir Robert, that has been mentioned, because I do believe that in the post-Brexit era, we do need to look at how we can improve those relationships, north-south and east-west. And I think perhaps the east-west relationship is the least invested in relationship of the three sets of relationships covered by the agreement. We would like to see that addressed. We're broadly content with the way the North-South Ministerial Council operates. We think there is now greater accountability. In New Decade, New Approach, we signed up to the idea of this new Belfast-Dublin economic corridor, so thus enhancing the level of economic cooperation, and indeed we can look at expanding that kind of cooperation. So we're up for strengthening those relationships. But I think, Sir Robert, we need to do more on the East-West relationship. I think in the post-Brexit era, there is a need to enhance the relationship and the institutional reflection of that relationship between the United Kingdom and the Republic of Ireland. The Republic of Ireland is our nearest neighbour. It's the nearest member state, if you like, for most parts of the UK. So I would like to see cooperation enhanced.
Does that mean Prime Minister continuing to attend British-Irish councils?
I think that's a positive development, Robin, but I think that we need to look at how the council functions and is there more? I think there's scope to do more, the scope to broaden the remit of the British-Irish Council in terms of cooperation.
It's certainly even more important now we don't attend European Council meetings. Certainly when I was Transport Minister, certainly Leo Varadkar was my opposite number, and those conversations aren't taking part in the sort of the sides.
Exactly, and Sir Robert, I mean, just take one example, like agri-food. North-South Ministerial Council enables us to continue cooperation with our neighbours in the Republic, even though we're now outside the EU and they remain in. But what about East-West cooperation on agri-food, on the spread of disease, for example, amongst animals? Rather than the UK government taking the view that we lock down Great Britain, shouldn't we be talking to the Republic of Ireland about how we cooperate to prevent disease, the spread of disease among animals in circumstances where there's a new, avian flu pandemic or whatever it might look like? We do have a common travel area. Why should that only apply, in terms of human beings? Shouldn't we be putting in place measures that ensure that other things that travel, that we cooperate in that as well?
Thank you. Claire, 5 minutes.
We've found in our inquiry a strong public appetite for some reform of Strand 1, and you've indicated some suggestions that you think could work. How do you think that should be done then? How do we progress a review of the agreement?
Well, the Belfast Agreement actually envisaged a process and set out in the agreement there is a process for review. And the first role I had in when I was elected to the Northern Ireland Assembly, I was appointed chair of the Assembly and Executive Review Committee. So we actually have a standing committee of the Assembly that constantly looks at these areas, tends to focus more on the Assembly's functioning, but I think there's a job of work that could be done there, Claire, in terms of looking at options for the future, and that is a cross-party group. It's representative of the membership of the Assembly. I think the Assembly is going to have its hands full with the new scrutiny committee that's going to be established for the purposes of scrutinising the whole issues around EU trade and so on and so forth. So that's why I think we need to be careful in talking about reform. Timing is important. You know, ministers going into an incoming executive are going to be, their desk is going to be full of decisions that need to be taken, issues around budgetary pressures, and of course the reform agenda itself, reform of the health service, etc., etc. So we need to approach this, I think, with a degree of caution and prioritise the areas that need to be prioritised. But there is a mechanism there, and I think there is, of course, the ability of the Assembly to consult, take evidence from civic society as well. But fundamentally, my view is these are political issues. They should be dealt with within the context of the political institutions themselves and by the political parties that operate those institutions, but with wider consultation.
Hopefully we get in there to do that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Glenn, and thank you very much to Jeffrey for giving such useful evidence and exhibiting the consistency I think the DUP have shown for many years over some of these issues. So thank you very much indeed. We'll now move on to our second session. We have Naomi Long joining us remotely. Good morning, Naomi. You're very welcome indeed. You're a long-term friend of this committee and, of course, a former colleague of ours here in the House of Commons. So if I could start off the questioning with a question about, obviously, as a member of the Alliance Party, your party played a significant role in the talks that led to the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. Can you outline to this committee how your party sees the legacy of the agreement in its 25th year?
Well, first of all, thank you, Sir Robert, for the opportunity to come along and address the committee today and to be able to do so remotely. I think in terms of the legacy of the agreement, it's really one, I think, of more sustained peace than we have had for a very long time prior to the agreement. I think the ending of the major conflict that we lived through and that I lived through as a young person has perhaps been the most significant outworking of the agreement. I think that we have also seen increasing democratisation of our society, and I think that that is a positive that has flown from the agreement. And also, I think that in that stability, we have been able to reform institutions in a way that will make them more inclusive in terms of our police service, our justice system, and indeed other institutions of state, which is all, I think, very important. However, I temper that and the huge transformation that we have seen with a degree of frustration that the transformation, I believe, had we been consistent in our delivery of particularly the Strand 1 institutions, may have moved on much further. So whilst there has been an uneasy peace, what we haven't benefited from in Northern Ireland is the kind of reconciliation that I think we would have hoped for in the more optimistic times, perhaps, of 1998. And I think whilst public patience at that time, understandably, there was huge elation. People were very pleased that we were moving away from conflict and towards a more peaceful and stable society. There are opportunities, for example, around prosperity and building our economy that have flown from that. But I think that there are issues remaining around paramilitarism embedded in our community, mental health issues arising from legacy issues, and a whole series of other things that have perhaps not been as addressed as we would have hoped and aspired to at that time. And I think that that has been in some ways a limiter in terms of the progress we've been able to make as a society and the political progress that we've been able to sustain. And I think the public find that frustrating. I think 25 years after the agreement, having an unstable Stormont and actually an increasingly unstable Stormont is an area of frustration and disappointment to certainly those of us who supported the Good Friday Agreement, and I would suspect to many who didn't.
Yes, thank you very much indeed. And indeed, this committee is currently conducting an inquiry into continued paramilitarism and their engagement in organised crime and other continuation, I think, of business for them, although maybe not in the same way they were in the past. Jim, can we go to you, Jim Sherman?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, thank you. And nice to see you on the screen, Naomi, if not in person. It's always a pleasure. A quick one in relation to Strand 1 institutions. I asked a similar question to Sir Jeffrey. I would maybe like to ask you the same question, if you don't mind, please. And just... obviously, we had some concerns with the agreement of 1998. We felt that the St Andrews agreement of 2006 moved things on, maybe not entirely the way that we hoped for. But I'd perhaps like to get your opinion in relation to where you see that St Andrews agreement. Do you see changes that perhaps might be beneficial for everyone? And if there were to be developments since 2006 which would be helpful from your opinion, would the Alliance refer to see that happening? Thanks very much.
Well, I mean, I think first of all, Jim, there were changes made in 2006, and maybe it's good to have the opportunity to clarify, because I listened to the last session and there was a lot of talk about the difference between majority rule and consensus. It's important to acknowledge that we have never been in favour of majority rule in Northern Ireland in that straightforward sense. But we're also not in favour of minority veto, which is what the St Andrews Agreement has actually delivered in practice, because that is a form of minority rule, which isn't actually effective at delivering stable government either. At the time of St Andrews, the test was not unanimity. Consensus did not mean unanimity. It was sufficient consensus. And so we were not, for example, signed up to the St Andrews Agreement as a party. We didn't support the changes that were being made at that time. We felt they were premature and potentially damaging to the future of the institutions. There were elements of what happened in St Andrews that we agreed with. So trying, for example, to facilitate more collectivity around the executive table, I think was a good move. But in fact, what was put in place were some barriers to progress in terms of having a lot of issues referred through the First and Deputy First Minister's office, which became a kind of checking house for everything that happened in the executive, and actually has impeded progress on many issues. And also, I think, in terms of the operation of the North-South Ministerial Council, impediments were introduced in terms of being able to have that proactive cooperation between the Assembly and the Irish Government. So some of those changes that may have been well-intentioned didn't necessarily deliver, I think, what was intended by them. In terms of change to the Good Friday Agreement, however, I mean, we were clear in 1998 that while we supported the principles of the agreement and we voted for the Good Friday Agreement, we had serious concerns about the architecture that surrounded the agreement. Dr. Farry, your colleague on the committee, actually co-authored an article in the Fordham Law Review in 1998-99 and referred to the potential weaknesses of the form of government that was being instituted with very rigid consociationalism, along with Sean Neeson, our then party leader. And much of that has come true. I mean, I did jokingly say that if you wanted to go to Stephen, I know it's not your bag, Jim, but if you wanted to go to Stephen and get some tips on the horses, he's probably not a bad man to ask, because 25 years on, much of what he predicted in 1998 has come to pass. So, I mean, I think we could foresee the difficulties, but the choice that lay in front of most of us in Northern Ireland in 1998 was, did we want to move forward on the basis of those principles, with devolution as the core piece that we wanted and with power sharing as part of that? And our answer to that was yes. Did we agree with every jot and tittle, to use a phrase, of what was in the agreement? I think most people would argue probably not. And we certainly have proposed and sustained an argument in favour of reform of the institutions. Our end goal in some ways is not so different to that set out by Sir Jeffrey, in that we would prefer a more normalised government and opposition system in Northern Ireland, where we had a better ability, I think, to flex and change government. That would be the end goal. But we recognise that we need to do that incrementally in terms of building trust and confidence within the community. And so the changes that we're recommending, the changes that we're proposing, I think are a step towards that, but without removing the checks and balances that I think we still need as a community because of the political history of this place. So I think some of what happened in St Andrews was positive. I think some of it has been negative, but I think the lesson learned is that it is not accurate to say that we need total consensus or unanimity to make change, because there was certainly not total consensus from the SDLP, the Ulster Unionists or ourselves around St Andrews.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thanks so much. Claire.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you, Naomi. We had a couple of weeks ago, we had Mark Durkin and John Alderdice here talking about the context and some of the trade-offs of the short period of negotiations in 1998, and I think the consensus was some of it was about not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good, and that the impetus was ending violence and I suppose a centuries-old conflict that hinged around an imbalance and a difference between unionism and nationalism and different forms of identity and sovereignty. Would you agree with that, or do you think there was another way to get the Good Friday Agreement signed that didn't involve designation and what you would legitimately see as mainstreaming sectarian division?
Well, I mean, we could debate that, I guess, Claire, for a long time, because what ifs are really hard to measure. But I mean, it would have been my preference that we had gone for something that was less rigid in terms of consociationalism. I think Mark Durkin actually called it the ugly scaffolding of the Good Friday Agreement. And I agree with him. It is ugly because it is very sectarian. I also think that at that time there was a perception that Northern Ireland would forever be locked in a battle between unionism and nationalism, with those being the predominant views of everyone in Northern Ireland, and that all of those of us who had for years carved out a third way, we would just disappear like snow off a ditch once there was an agreement, that we were there as a peace building mechanism rather than as an alternative ideology for how Northern Ireland could work. And I think that's been debunked fairly robustly over recent years, as we've seen the growth of that centre ground, for want of a better description, and if you like, of that non-aligned grouping, which now represents 20% of all of those elected to the Assembly, as opposed to in 1998, when I think it represented 8 out of 108. So there is a genuine challenge, I think, around how we accommodate difference and diversity. Northern Ireland, like every other part of the UK and these islands more generally, is becoming an increasingly diverse society. People are migrating to Northern Ireland. We want that to happen. We want new people to come and to share their experiences, their talent, their culture with us and enrich our society. But in order to do that, we have to create space for them to participate as active members of our community. And it's very hard to do that if they're not aligned along unionist or nationalist lines. There are also many people in our community, even those who hold broadly unionist or broadly nationalist views, who are not identified as unionist or nationalist as their primary identification, that their real identification, the thing that they want most, the thing that drives their politics, is that desire to build a shared and reconciled future for the people of Northern Ireland. And so I think that the constraints of the Good Friday Agreement, I accept, were there, and the challenges of negotiating in a multi-party talks, I don't underestimate, given we're back in that scenario again. So I understand the challenges that it presents, but I do think that it has left a legacy. And I think in 1998, we were an optimistic people. So we were on a trajectory out of what had been 30 years of fairly sustained horror in Northern Ireland. And we hoped, above all hope, that the goodwill that got us the Good Friday Agreement would persist, and that if there were rough edges, if there were awkward scaffolding, that we would be in a position with the same goodwill and generosity to resolve those issues collectively together. And sadly, that never happened, because people recognised, I think, particularly the next wave, if you like, of politicians who came in and the changes at St Andrews, people recognised the power of a veto. And unfortunately, a veto if you're offered a veto, it's much easier than saying to you, well, what we'd like you to do is find consensus through collaboration, cooperation and negotiation. So we incentivised the idea that you could sit back and say no, as opposed to step up and say yes. And I think that that has been the biggest failing of the political institutions, is that they didn't incentivise cooperation. And it's the fundamental change that we are seeking in our proposed reforms, is that we would work based on weighted majority votes for those key issues that are currently subject to what are called cross-community votes, but exclude the only cross-community parties in the Assembly. So we would like to see those replaced with weighted majority votes, and that would incentivise building a cross-community consensus within the Assembly, and I think would be much more productive as a way of doing business, and then that would flow, I think, into the other business that we do as an Assembly and Executive.
Thank you. I think that latter point that you made was more like the consensus from Mark and John, which makes it sound a bit biblical. Not that there was never, that nobody envisaged that there would be people who have no constitutional view, that there was. It was about getting us over the issue of finding a way to get people into a non-violent structure, and that it wouldn't and shouldn't last forever. And I think there is a consensus that the time has more than come to address that. And I think their sense, the impression they gave, that absolutely it's possible for people who hold constitutional views and who designate as Unionist and Nationalist to be entirely committed to getting the best for Northern Ireland and to building a shared and united community, and who can be cross-community. And I'm sure you would agree with that.
Well, I mean, I think ultimately the only cross-community designation in the Assembly is other. I mean, if you designate by definition,
who are Unionist and Nationalist and who are cross-community and who are non-sectarian and who want the best for Northern Ireland.
If I could finish my answer, the only truly cross-community designation in the Assembly is when you don't designate as Unionist or Nationalist. When you say that you're Nationalist or Unionist, you are representing that community in the Assembly. However, I accept that there are politicians within those blocs who, when they are making their decisions, are driven by a desire to build a better future. And I would certainly not suggest that every politician who designates as Unionist or Nationalist is sectarian. I think the challenge is how we actually move away from those designations so that we're not locked into the kind of Unionist versus Nationalist conflict all of the time. So I'll give you a classic example of why I think the current structures are fundamentally flawed. At the very first sitting of the current Assembly after the elections in May 2022, 72% of sitting Assembly members voted in favour of Patsy McGlone to be Speaker of the Assembly. Only 71% of the population of Northern Ireland voted for the Good Friday Agreement. Now, if that weighted majority was sufficient to carry the Good Friday Agreement and the constitutional change that flowed from that under an international agreement, it seems to me unconscionable that we can't constitute the Assembly with a Speaker on the basis of a higher vote. And yet we were unable to do so because a minority of the Assembly opposed it. Now, that to me is a fundamental challenge.
You'll be aware that the SDLP not only wrote to all the parties and the governments highlighting exactly that point, and we've huge common ground on the alternative structures, and you'll know we had amendments down about qualified majority voting, and Alliance voted for them, and indeed we had positive soundings from the DUP. So there's no disagreement about the necessity to change. Quite simply, you and I and many others can see that those structures are not delivering in the way that was envisaged. And I'm glad that there's consensus that people who do hold constitutional views can absolutely be cross-community and non-sectarian. And I think that's important as we go forward and not putting people just too narrowly into boxes. So we're really keen to.
Well, it would be helpful, if I may say, it's helpful if we don't put people into boxes as the first thing we do when we walk in through the doors of the new Assembly.
And
the first thing we do as Assembly members is we have to queue up and fill in a register to say whether we're Unionist, Nationalist or other, and in our case we say United Community. But I think if we got away from that, because as you will know, Claire, as a former member of this Assembly, most of the issues we deal with do not divide along sectarian lines in terms of how they impact on communities.
I think you've got really good ideas around some of the solutions, and I completely agree. And as I said here, the 3 times I signed in, it was as Social Democrat, Common Nationalist, because they are both parts of my political identity, and so some of those we talked about and we've explored forward how you start to unpick designation. And I think with a core aim of one, not overly putting people into boxes, and two, removing some of the vetoes. How many votes in the last mandate were subject to in the sitting from the start of 2020 till the collapse? How many were subject to a cross-community veto?
I haven't counted them, to be honest, but there were a significant number that would have affected me. Every budget has to be subject to cross-community vote. Some parts of legislation, so there were occasions where I brought bills as a minister to the chamber and my vote was discounted as part of the parallel consent mechanism, because it isn't a cross-community vote. Let's be really clear. What it is parallel consent. So you need an overall majority of members voting, and then a majority of Unionists and a majority of Nationalists, and there's no consideration given to those of us who do not align. So my vote counts for less in those votes than other members of the Assembly, and I don't believe that is justifiable or
I think, we absolutely
and I
want
believe
to
I believe
get
it
to
is
a removal of
potentially I believe it is potentially challengeable. However, in terms of the numbers of votes, there are a number of other circumstances in which there are cross-community votes anytime. And it has changed to 2 parties, but anytime 30 members of the House coming from 2 parties or more sign a petition of concern, a cross-community vote can be triggered. And there is no other stricture on that. So whilst cross-community voting was initially, parallel consent voting was initially expected to be only applicable in areas where there was historic concern, so things like identity, constitutional issues and so on. That was never laid down in a justiciable form, so there was no way to ever challenge in law when it was used. And essentially petitions of concern in the previous mandate, so in the kind of run up to 2016, had floated around the Assembly chamber like confetti, and it became absolutely destructive. The other form of cross-community voting, as it's called, but again parallel consent, operates within the executive itself. And so ministers bringing proposals to the executive for discussion can find themselves, first of all, refused access to the executive by the First and Deputy First Minister, but also can trigger a cross-community vote within the executive, which can block proposals actually going forward. So both of those parallel consent votes have an impact, both the formal in the chamber and the informal in the executive.
Absolutely. We're talking about some of the, as I say, where there is consensus about trying to unpick them. Some of the thornier problems we were coming up with, I mean, the electorate have sort of taken away some of the veto. It's very much more difficult to get to a petition of concern. And as you know, many parties have tried to clarify the grounds. I know we have used them on things like welfare reform, because we do think there's disproportionate impacts in certain communities. Things like First and Deputy First Minister, how would that work if we didn't have designation? Do you think there would be a way, or should we still try to represent different communities at the top tier of the executive?
I think we would do it by party size. I think that's how it would work in most coalition governments, that it would be based on party size.
So a First Minister and then not a Deputy First Minister or a Joint First Minister, but just other...
Well, we believe it should be Joint First Ministers, because in effect that's what they are. I wouldn't change it, I have to say, in this mandate, because I think that would be unfair, because I think that people fought the election on the basis that there would be a First and Deputy First Minister, and I think it's important that we respect the vote on that basis. But I also think that it is important that we have an opportunity in terms of what we do as an executive and assembly to be more collaborative. So I have no issue with, our proposals are often misrepresented as trying to, first of all, as trying to be a fix for the issues around the protocol. These proposals pre-exist the current hiatus. We made these arguments in the last hiatus when it was Sinn Féin who had collapsed the institutions. So this is not new. We actually engaged with your own party in negotiating what the terms and conditions around petitions of concern might be, and how we could specify and limit the use of petitions of concern in the chamber because they were being abused. And we also have developed proposals that we believe are an incentive for people to participate. The issue here is not about seeking to exclude any party. I don't want the DUP to be outside the executive. I want the DUP to be inside the executive. I believe that that is important. But I believe that for as long as they are able to keep everybody else outside the executive, there's no incentive for them to go in. I believe that if they thought that we were going to move on to government without them, then they would be back at the table doing their jobs. And I think that that's been evidenced by the fact that even when the First Minister withdrew from office, his ministerial colleagues remained in office operating their departments. So I think what we need to do is incentivise the creation of the executive. We need to do away with the designation system progressively over time, because it's already been done in this mandate. But I do think that the idea that we bring people in and the first thing we do is focus on historic divisions rather than on future opportunities is the wrong starting point for any set of institutions that actually want to be future focused and deliver progressive policy.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Bob Stewart.
Hello, Naomi. Nice to see you. Good morning.
Good morning.
My question is quite simple, and I've slightly got the idea of what you'd answer already. My question is, as they're currently constituted, do you think the Assembly and the Executive, if they were to be allowed to function, would provide a decent government for Northern Ireland?
Well, that's actually a more complex question than you give yourself credit for.
I know, I'm sorry about that. I'm trying to be short because we're short of time.
In terms of what you can achieve as a minister, undoubtedly you can. I mean, some of you will see the frames that are hanging behind me, and it's 5 pieces of legislation, major pieces, which I passed in the 2.5 years when I was Minister of Justice. And there was largely consensus around what we were trying to achieve in those major pieces of legislation. So you can govern and you can make a difference. So undoubtedly that is the case. And with the right attitude, I believe that you can continue to do it. However, there are fundamental weaknesses and instabilities. I always go back to my engineering analogies because that's where I started my career. And there are instabilities in the foundations of the institutions. And so because there are two parties that have disproportionately control over what happens within the executive, it is not collective. I mean, I sat in a recent meeting and was told the importance of compromise and of negotiation. And I know that as a minister, because the only way a single alliance minister could get anything through an executive that was made up of a majority of DUP and Sinn Féin members was to negotiate and compromise with them in order to get through what I could in that case. But those two parties, provided they agreed, didn't have to negotiate or compromise with me. So there is a disparity in terms of power, and there is also the ability for either of those two parties to simply walk away if they wish to do so and end the executive. And that's a power that no other party has. So I think that that disparity in terms of the power dynamics makes it very difficult to have true collectivity. I think that there are structural things that we can change. I think there are management things and governance issues that we can change that are fairly straightforward, probably standing order type changes. But I think there is a more fundamental change that needs to be made. And if I could perhaps just give an example. At the moment, we are in severe financial difficulties in Northern Ireland. Our budget is incredibly stretched, and some very difficult and challenging decisions around reform and transformation, but also around changes to our finances will need to be made by any incoming executive. Now, that might be something that ministers would be willing to step up and do, knowing that they have 4 or 5 years of a term to deliver, and that by the time they return to the electorate, the outworkings of that and the positive benefit of that change, which may be publicly controversial, will have been experienced. But it is a lot to ask, particularly of the smaller parties in the executive, to step forward and take those risks. If at any time either of the two main parties can pull the rug from under our feet, collapse the executive and force a snap election.
So the short answer is you're not hopeful that it would work?
I think it can work, but I think the only way to have stable government on a continuous basis is to implement the reforms as we have suggested, that are fairly modest, I have to say, in that they still reflect the right to be in government based on your mandate. They simply remove the right to prevent government being formed.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Carla.
Thank you, and thank you. Nice to see you, Naomi.
You too.
On screen. Just 3 very quick questions. Alliance within your paper talk about reforming the petition of concern to 3 key areas, one of which is identity-based issues. And I suppose just what confidence can you give to unionists, given that you don't accept that the trade and constitutional impact of the protocol strike to the very heart of the unionist and British identity?
Well, I think the first thing to say, Carla, is that I have never argued that these are not significant issues for unionism. But equally, I have been clear that I don't believe they are matters for the Assembly, because they are matters of international trade and development and international relations, which are not devolved matters. And therefore, to apply the tests of consensus and cross-community support to those would be as ridiculous as if we had asked for cross-community support for Brexit to be a prerequisite for the UK government being able to implement policy. And no one at that time, I mean, the number of times that I was told by colleagues of yours to suck it up, Buttercup, and move on over Brexit because the UK had decided. If I had £1 for every one of them, I'd be a millionaire. But the reality is that there was no consensus. In fact, the vast majority of people in Northern Ireland opposed Brexit. It is what it is. We're now outside the EU. And the consequences of that are the protocol, the Windsor Framework, and all that has flown from that. And I think that they have to be held to the same test as the original decision, not to a different and higher test. So had we had to have cross-community consent for Brexit, then I think it would be reasonable to say there should also be cross-community consent for the arrangements post-Brexit. But I don't think it is reasonable to say that there was no cross-community consent required for Brexit, but the post-Brexit arrangements need to be held to this higher threshold. In terms of the importance to unionism, I do recognise that. I think it's sad that unionism didn't recognise the significance of the decision they were taking when they campaigned for Brexit and the implications of that. But I did raise it at the time. I sat in a studio with one of your colleagues, Ian Paisley, and said to him at the time when we weren't sure we would even be able to maintain free movement. And I asked him how he would feel, and he took his passport out and said, quite happy to show my British passport anywhere, anytime, even if it's going to Westminster every week. So, I mean, this was denied as an issue at the time when Brexit was being debated. Those of us who raised it raised our concerns because we recognised it would be challenging for unionists if there was some friction at the Irish Sea. And the reason that the focus at that time was on the Irish Sea, to be clear, was not, as Sir Jeffrey suggested, to placate nationalism. It was a recognition of the practicalities of trade. There are 7 ports and airports between GB and Northern Ireland. There are 300 border crossings along, over 200 border crossings along about 300 miles of border between the Irish Republic and Northern Ireland. Now, as a matter of pure and simple pragmatism and practicality, it was always obvious that the easier way to deal with checks was going to be at those established ports and airports where there were already SPS checks, where there were already a number of other facilities taking place, that would be the obvious place. And that is why, to be frank, I raised this with unionist colleagues at the time because of my concern. So I don't think it's fair to say that we're not concerned about it. In terms of reassurance, the fact that you would be able to sign a petition of concern on issues of identity under our suggested proposals, I think demonstrate that is our intent, to protect unionism, nationalism, but also with respect to protect those people in Northern Ireland who are not unionist or nationalist and have every but as much a stake in the future of this place as anyone else. And I think it is absolutely right that we rebalance that and we don't end up in situations where petitions of concern are abused in a way that is simply to obstruct good governance. And that is the purpose of our proposals. And they do offer the protections that were originally envisaged in the Good Friday Agreement, because it talks about using petitions for issues of particular concern to Northern Ireland.
Yeah, well, I think the proposals ultimately don't actually go or don't give enough detail around the validity of these issues and how they would actually be determined and what would be acceptable under petition of concern. However,
we have set out, Carla, just on that particular issue, we have set out in a previous paper during the NDNA negotiations, which was shared with your colleagues at the time, much more detailed proposals about the call-off panel of legal advisors and how that would be constituted and how they would reach a determination on whether the threshold for a petition of concern has been met. So what you have there is a summary of our three main asks, but there is a much more detailed paper on the petition of concern reform that I think would be helpful for you potentially to read, because it gives you the background as to how it would operate, and that it would be operated independently by legal experts, and we would set the threshold in legislation that needed to be met so that it was justiciable and that people would have recourse if their petition was rejected for the wrong reasons, or indeed if a petition was accepted for the wrong reasons.
We will see. In relation then just to a number of your political representatives from your party, have argued that if the DUP refuse to join the Assembly, that the train is leaving the station with or without them. And in my opinion, that's quite similar to the themes that proposed in terms of immediate measures around the executive formation in your party's submission to the inquiry. Is this advocating an executive without the largest unionist party? And do you believe that such a scenario would see an executive that commanded any form of acceptability or validity on a cross-community basis? And I know that since our exiting the executive for the reasons of the protocol, the Alliance have been extremely exercised, and you say that this isn't new. Well, I would actually disagree with that, because when the Assembly was collapsed for 3 years, we heard little or nothing from the Alliance Party against Sinn Féin in relation to their demands and their issues for collapsing the Assembly, which were much less significant than that of which the protocol is undermining and doing to Northern Ireland and its place within the United Kingdom. So if you could maybe just walk us through your thinking, particularly around that train leaving the station with or without the largest unionist party.
Well, I think first and foremost, Carla, I have to challenge your perception that we didn't speak out in the 3 years when the Assembly was down before. You may hear us a lot more vocally now, but then we were 7 and now we are 17. So perhaps that's the reason for the amplification of our voice. We are now the third largest party in Northern Ireland, not the fifth. And as a result of that, get considerably more attention when we do make a statement and have something to say. If you want to rewind the clock to the previous issues around the Assembly collapse, you will know, of course, that I did say we should get back into government with or without the largest nationalist party back then. So this isn't news. And actually, your own party leader at the time made that very point, that she wanted to go straight back into government with or without Sinn Féin. So it seems odd that it would be a criticism of us that we would be agreeing with your former party leader. What this is actually about, to be clear, and these are proposals that we have had for some time and actually debated and discussed with both governments and other parties during the NDNA negotiations, is about trying to create a more stable basis where no single party, and I say no single party, can withdraw consent for government and collapse the government. Obviously, if no unionist party is willing to go into government, or no nationalist party is willing to go into government, or perhaps we should consider if no cross-community party is willing to go into government, we have an issue. But if we are able to be broadly representative, as for example the Good Friday Agreement vote was taken as broadly representative of unionists, nationalists and others, despite your own party not consenting to it, we moved forward with sufficient consensus, and I think we should be able to do that in terms of the institutions. Had we waited for the DUP in 1998, this would all be a moot conversation. But we moved on, and eventually the DUP, as I expect would happen if there were reforms, the DUP or Sinn Féin, depending on who was currently threatening collapse, if the institutions moved on without them, would come and join, because there is no perspective from which I see the DUP not wanting to be in government or me not wanting them to be there and to be represented. What I object to is the ability of Sinn Féin and the DUP to be able to unilaterally collapse the executive without any consideration of the lack of consent for that from the majority of other participants in the democracy and the structures here. I also would just draw your attention, if I may, to Sir Jeffrey a number of times a few years ago spoke about the fact that other parties in 2016, ourselves, the SDLP and Ulster Unionists, had, and I think he described it as the luxury of being able to walk away from government and into opposition, and that there was a disadvantage, if you will, to Sinn Féin and the DUP because they had to be in government for government to be formed. What we have proposed would level the playing field. The entitlement of Sinn Féin and the DUP to be in government would be unchanged. That would be as of right in law. But if either party decided, for whatever reason, either because they were objecting or protesting an issue, or because they wanted a term in opposition, perhaps to realign, perhaps to refresh their ideas, perhaps to develop new people, they would have the same freedom that we enjoyed in 2016 and that the SDLP and Ulster Unionists enjoyed in 2016 to decline a place in an executive. Because I think that right not to be in government in a coalition is actually pretty fundamental. A party should not be obligated to be in coalition. The coalition in Northern Ireland is mandatory only in the sense that it's based on mandate. It is not compulsory, not at least for those other parties outside the First and Deputy First Minister's office. And I don't believe it should be compulsory for those within that structure.
But you're continual speaking of sufficient consensus rather than unanimity. Do you honestly believe that agreements which do not command the support of the majority of unionists are plausible in a divided society?
Carla, do you believe that agreements that don't command the support of a party that has 17 MLAs and 68 councillors are plausible in our society? If the third largest party doesn't agree it, do you believe that's plausible? Your party believed it was plausible to have government without nationalism involved. Then it was plausible to have government without Sinn Féin involved when they were the largest nationalist party. The truth is that you've only become concerned about the issue of consensus since it has impacted on your own party. The issue here for me is about consistency across the piece. We have always operated on the basis of sufficient consensus. It has never been unanimity. We did not sign up to the Stormont House Agreement that was back in the day. We had reservations there. We didn't sign up fully to St Andrews. And there have been many other times in this process when many of the parties have not agreed, but Sinn Féin and the DUP have, and so it is carried with sufficient consensus. To now say that the bar must be higher because you want particular things out of the institutions is inconsistent in terms of your approach to date. So I would like to see maximum consensus. To be absolutely clear, I would prefer to see all of the parties entitled to be in government, and in government now. What I am arguing for in terms of reform is a mechanism to ensure that those parties that are willing to be in government are not prevented from being in government when one party objects to forming a government. And that to me is really important in terms of democratic stability, and more importantly, that one party withdrawing consent for that government can't simply collapse it instantaneously. I think that that is the right choice to make, and I think that it is the fair way to approach it, and it doesn't affect unionism or disadvantage unionism in any way, shape or form more than any other grouping in the Assembly.
Well, I would say that you're maybe not best placed to tell unionism what it's getting from your proposals or what it's not getting from your proposals, because a lot of unions
I am objective in terms of the proposals and what they offer, and they would apply equally to nationalists, to unionists and to others.
Well, the fact that, you're content that the train leaves the station without the largest unionist party and you're willing to exclude the largest unionist party. I don't think there's any need for dictating to unionism. But in relation to the inconsistency,
I would like to answer that
Carla,
point.
could you just
I would like to answer that
before?
Very specific point, because it's very important. At no point did I say I would be content for the train to leave the station without unionists. I said that I want the largest unionist party. I was very clear that that I want the largest unionist party in the executive. I want to incentivise the largest unionist party getting back into the executive, but I want to ensure that neither of the two main parties retains the power to upend the executive and institutions at will. That's a very different conversation than the one that you have just portrayed it. And the other thing to say in terms of your wider point, in terms of being happy to move on without unionism or to exclude, nowhere in our proposals is there a recommendation to exclude any party from government. It is a choice for each individual party whether or not to go into government. We made that decision in 2011 to go into government as Justice Minister. We made a decision in 2016 to not go into government. We made a decision in 2017 to go into government, in 2020 to go into government. So we have made that choice on different occasions by ourselves. We were not excluded, we made the choice, and we would offer that same choice to the DUP and to Sinn Féin, or to whichever party ends up being the largest or second largest party in Northern Ireland. But we certainly have no proposals, and I would defy anyone to point to proposals that we have put forward that would exclude anyone from government. We are enabling and protecting people's mandatory right to be in coalition. It is for them to decide whether they take it up or not.
Well, it's a mandatory obligation at the moment. It's a mandatory obligation at the moment.
It is an obligation on the two main parties, but not on anyone else.
Yeah.
And I believe that that disparity needs to be corrected.
Thank you. Carla, have you got any more?
Fine. I just would make the point, it's not a question, around the inconsistency, and you've talked about the inconsistency within our own party. At the end of the day, you know, your party signed up to the Good Friday Agreement, our party didn't, but you know, that within that was consensus, and it's just unfortunate that you're now taking that in a different direction. But thank you.
Which is the point that Jeffrey made.
I think I have answered that point, that it was sufficient consensus. 71% of the people in Northern Ireland was deemed sufficient consensus on which to move forward. Your own party objected to the Good Friday Agreement, yet operated the institutions under it. And there was not consensus at that time, and I think it would be a fallacy of massive proportions now to pretend that the DUP were in some way in consensus about the Good Friday Agreement, yet we managed to deliver progress regardless.
Thank you, Stephen Farrier. Somehow I suspect this might be a more friendly session.
Must work as Good morning, Naomi.
Don't always be certain about these things.
So anyway, moving swiftly on from that one, just two questions. First of all, on mechanics. Naomi, just very briefly explain for the benefit of the committee exactly how our proposal for tweaking the rules would work in practice if one party who is currently entitled doesn't take up that offer. And secondly, could you also just briefly talk us through the current anomaly in the system? You talk about Alliance now being the third largest party. Perhaps one day Alliance could be the first or second largest party, but how the rules currently work against a cross-community party in the context where they're the second largest party?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing to say is, and I hope that it's been clear, our proposals are not about trying to exclude any of the parties who are entitled to a position in government for being able to take that up. In fact, it would be my desire long term that we would have voluntary coalition, but I don't believe that we have matured sufficiently as a society at this point to do that. I believe that we saw in 2016 how quickly government unravelled when only Sinn Féin and the DUP were in government, and actually when the smaller parties, as we were then, weren't in a position to actually at times act as the meat in the sandwich, the filling or whatever it might be, to create a buffer between the parties. So I do think it's important that we have as inclusive an executive as possible. I believe that's good for Northern Ireland, and I also believe it could be good for decision making if there is stability that goes along with it. Our proposals would be that, as is currently the case, the largest party would be offered the post of First Minister and could accept or reject. The next largest party would be offered the post of Deputy First Minister and could accept or reject. And if those parties then, if neither of those parties will take up their post, then we are in a difficult position, because one of those two parties would need to be in government for it to be sustained. But if one of those parties will go into government and the other one won't, then you would simply move to the next subsequent largest party and offer them a post, as you do under the Hunt in the current system of allocation of ministers. And we would also like to see the entire executive subject to a a truly cross-community vote where it is endorsed by the Assembly as a whole to be able to take forward the work that it needs to do. In terms of the anomaly that arises with the growth of the centre ground and those who are non-aligned, as we read the legislation currently, there are a number of questions around what is in legislation and what is not that need to be clarified. So as we read the legislation, if Alliance were to be the largest party under St Andrews, not under the Good Friday Agreement legislation, but under the changes at St Andrews, Alliance would qualify to be First Minister. So the talk about what would happen if one of the main two communities wasn't represented in the First and Deputy First Minister's office is somewhat bizarre, because were we to be the largest party, even if we were smaller as an overall designation, we would be entitled to be First Minister. However, if we were to be the second largest party, unless the other designation was also the second largest designation, we don't believe that we would be entitled to be Deputy First Minister. Further, we don't know whether other is the designation at all, or whether what we sign the register as is the designation. So, for example, Jerry Carroll of People Before Profit also signs the register as other than Unionist or Nationalist, and as a result is unaligned. But we don't know, for example, if there were more unaligned members from other parties who signed the register with a different format to Alliance, whether they would collectively count as a designation as other, would be treated as such, which is how it works in voting. But we don't know if that's how it would work in the appointment of First and Deputy First Ministers. And so I think that there are anomalies that arise now because society has moved on. It should be a great encouragement that as a result of the Good Friday Agreement, more and more people feel free to designate and define themselves differently from the divisions of the past, to be able to break free of those shackles and do other. And I think that that's a positive thing for Northern Ireland society, the growth of that centre, the growth of that momentum towards a more united community approach to how we do our politics. That was always the intention of those who were the architects of the agreement, that we would find more consensus as a community, that we would grow in confidence in our identity and feel less inhibited about being able to do things on an openly cross-community basis. Unfortunately, the institutions of the Good Friday Agreement have kind of set our historic divisions in aspic and don't really give us the flexibility to be able to reflect that in our institutions. And that's why I think a reform of the institutions is essential. I also think that that has been recognised. So Jeffrey mentioned the Assembly and Executive Review Committee. They reached the same conclusion at the end of the last mandate, that we needed reform. And they had taken evidence which narrowed it in on the three areas which our proposals address. So things like how we would deal with voting, because there is a recognition that to discount the votes of 18 members of the Assembly on key issues is not a sustainable position, either morally or legally, but also to look at how we identify people within the Assembly chamber and whether or not that is constructive in terms of the designation system and the sign-in system. So the Assembly and Executive Review Committee, whilst not having arrived at a position on all of those things, has identified exactly the same challenges that we as a party have identified. Collectively, there have been proposals. Claire mentioned the move to weighted majority voting for the election of a speaker. I suppose I would argue very strongly that if you do it for speaker, why not for the budget? Why not for some of the other things, the key votes in the Assembly, rather than having one section of our community that happens to be the section I represent disregarded in that final round of voting. So this is about trying to make our society more equal, but also recognising its increasing diversity. And I think in practice, there are ways that this could happen as set out in our proposals.
Speaking of reform more generally, the committee has heard some evidence about people supporting reform in principle, but saying it should happen after restoration. We've also understand that's the position of both the UK and Irish governments at present. We're talking about reform being an option potentially before. But what's your reaction to those who say yes to reform, but you have to wait to get the institutions restored?
Well, I mean, I've lived most of my political career meeting with governments and being told jam tomorrow. We've been told as a party, go off and get bigger and come back and we'll deal with it then. And we went off and got bigger and come back and they say, oh, it's awkward now. So, you know, other parties, when they raise their issues, let's be really clear. If you're one of the two main parties and you behave badly, you throw your toys out of the pram and you walk out of the executive and cause a crisis. People are falling over themselves to accommodate your demands. We have never been in that position. We have never tried to disrupt the institutions. Carla's right, there are things about the institutions that we disagree with, despite supporting the Good Friday Agreement, and I explained at the outset the logic behind that, because I saw it as a process of transformation, not as a final destination. But from our perspective, when we bring constructive proposals that would prevent crises and prevent collapse, they're put to the side in favour of addressing the demands of parties that are causing disruption. Now, I understand why that's the case, but it's a bit like Pavlov's dog. If you keep doing the same thing, you will keep getting the same reaction. If parties know that by behaving badly, they will get more reward, then they will behave badly to get that reward and to get attention. And Sir Jeffrey, I think, rightly pointed out that he reached a conclusion that by being in government and being sensible and trying to pursue his objectives from within government, which I believe was the right strategy, he felt he wasn't getting heard. But as soon as he walked out of government, government seemed to listen. Now, I would argue there's a slightly different reason for that, given the context of the UK and Brexit and EU relations and everything else. But that's the perception, and the perception actually matters. From our perspective, I think that it's important that we are clear in this committee. We have not said reform is a red line. We have not said that without reform, we will not go back into the executive. But we are saying that without reform, the executive will not be sustained. We said in 2020, I said it to Julian Smith and I said it to Simon Coveney, that I believed that the executive would be restored for a limited time only. And in the end, I was proven correct. Had it not been for COVID, it would have been much more limited, because that compelled people to remain in government. But things were very rocky in the executive. I believe if we restore the executive now, there is absolutely no longevity to the institutions as they are. They are fundamentally unstable. And so we're not making demands for our own interests. We are saying very clearly that irrespective of whether the DUP decide to come back into government or not, this conversation about reform will not go away. Because we need stability to be able to give people in Northern Ireland confidence in their political institutions, to be able to deliver the transformation and reform of our public services and public finances, and to be able to grow our economy. Because what we know is that when people come to Northern Ireland to invest, when businesses are making choices about growth and expansion, they need to know that there is political certainty underpinning all of that. And we can't offer that at the moment, because we have this cycle of ransom politics and stop-go government. So I think it's really important. We're not saying it's a red line to go back into government, but we are saying that it is a red line for government if they want stable institutions. I see no reason why preparatory work around reform cannot go hand in hand with the work to restore the executive and assembly under its current format. I also think, however, that as time goes on, the implications of continued failure to restore the executive become more and more serious. And I know, Stephen, you have been participating in the negotiations with civil service and others around our financial challenges, and you know the depth of the crisis that we face. By November this year, we will be in a crisis that is probably, certainly in this year and possibly in the next 3, irrecoverable. And it gets worse with every passing month. Now, there comes a point where you ask, how many complex arrangements will the Secretary of State consider to maintain the hiatus before he considers relatively simple proposals to reform the institutions and enable good government? And I think we are now at a tipping point in that. So we're not making it a precondition, but I do think if we want to have good and stable government, it has to be part of the mix in terms of going back into the executive and assembly for all of the parties' sake.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Robin.
Thank you, Chair. In your party's written evidence to the inquiry, the impression given about the North, South and East West bodies is one of unfulfilled potential. I think it was interesting hearing from Sir Jeffrey that he felt that there was more that could be done on an East-West basis. What would you like to see done to strengthen their ability to deliver effective cooperation on an all-island basis? And how, in doing that, can you reassure Unionists that that is pragmatic, practical cooperation, not anything that undermines their position in the UK?
Well, I mean, I think first and foremost, the East-West elements of that cooperation are essential. I mean, I think since 2016, part of the reason we have struggled as an institution in Northern Ireland is because of the fractious relationships between London and Dublin, and I think that has been profoundly unhelpful. So I think that the institutions of the Good Friday Agreement that are there to promote cooperation, collaboration, and the kind of independence from Northern Ireland politics that was envisaged in the Good Friday Agreement, where people were scrupulously independent of the local parties, I think it's really important that we return to that. I also think that in the absence of the opportunity to have discussions around the European Commission and around all of those other bodies that we were previously engaged with, they become more important as a point of contact between the British and Irish government, and as a way actually for the UK government to be able to raise issues that may be happening within the EU but may be particularly acutely felt within these islands with the Irish government as another route to having our voice heard. So I think that they are potentially very powerful, but have often, I have to say, been performative in how they've been delivered. And I would like to see much more depth to those relationships, because I think ultimately the London-Dublin relationship is one that underpins everything else. It's the one that started this process, whether that was through the Anglo-Irish Agreement or the Downing Street Declaration. It was all of that coming together that was really important. In terms of the North-South bodies, I think there is huge potential. I mean, the economy in the south of Ireland at the moment is in danger of overheating. There are opportunities for Northern Ireland to benefit hugely from alignment with that. The Irish government has money to invest in infrastructure, and some of that key infrastructure could impact very directly on Northern Ireland, whether that's road connections between, for example, Dublin and Donegal, which could pass through Northern Ireland and lead to better road connections between some of our major towns, whether that's things like the North-South interconnector, whether it's their interest in, for example, building offshore wind. We have at the minute the only licensed place for the construction facility for offshore wind on this island. So the opportunities for us to benefit from those North-South arrangements are enormous. And so I think from a completely practical and pragmatic point of view, we need to continue to develop those relationships and to do so in an agile way. Again, I think the North-South Ministerial Council and some of the North-South meetings can tend to be a bit stagnant in terms of how they're delivered and less agile than perhaps they need to be to deliver real cooperation. But I think how you reassure Unionists about that is to ensure that the East-West bit is working, that the internal institutions are working, and that the North-South piece is working as well. The key is too, for the North-South institutions, if I could just perhaps reflect, they have tended to be the canary in the mine for the institutions as a whole. So when things are going badly in the Assembly and Executive, the North-South institutions tend to be the first casualty, with ministers not being able, for example, Unionist ministers refusing to accompany Nationalist ministers to meetings or refusing to attend ministers because, of course, people attend in pairs, which is a rather bizarre arrangement, but nevertheless is the arrangement that we have. With the exception of Justice, where we have our own arrangements and the Justice Minister has an agreement with the Irish Government, but we all report back to the Assembly, so that's the first thing. Every minister who has a North-South ministerial meeting reports back to the Assembly about the content of that, about the programme, and can be questioned on that in a ministerial statement. The second thing is that they are accompanied, so there will always be somebody there at the table to hear what the discussions are and what's happening. But I think that you need to look at all the institutions in the round in the Good Friday Agreement. So it's about us working together internally in Northern Ireland for the best interests of the people we represent, working collaboratively on a cross-border basis where it is in all of our interests to do so. And there are many economies of scale that we could be able to benefit from if we were willing to do that more proactively. And it's also about the UK and Irish governments working together to underpin that, so it doesn't become in any way a conflict in terms of people's national identity. And I guess it's about trying to disentangle people's sense of identity with practicalities. Most people in Northern Ireland don't feel their sense of identity is threatened because, for example, the Department of Foreign Affairs might fund events or fund training courses or fund community organisations in their local area. So they shouldn't feel threatened if, by the same token, we get some investment in Northern Ireland as a result of wanting to expand the railway network into the West, and Northern Ireland benefits in some way from that. The important thing, I think, is that all of our objectives are aligned. That's where the programme for government, working closely with the UK and Irish governments, comes into play, so that it is the Northern Ireland Assembly that drives the direction of travel, not London or Dublin, and that they align with what Northern Ireland is trying to achieve, and where there is good overlap and a good alignment, then we can benefit from the extra that we get from those relationships. But I don't see it as in any way a challenge to people's identity or as a threat if we do that in a constructive and a balanced and a transparent way.
And beyond making them less performative, I accept that, the sort of valid criticism certainly of some of the BIC meetings that I attended. But what other changes would you suggest to the East-West institutions to make them more effective or more in-depth? Is it partly about the commitment that ministers and, dare I say, prime ministers put into preparing for them? Is it about the seniority of the attendees? What would you like to see in terms of how that moves forward?
I think it's all of those things. I mean, I think we are uniquely in these islands. We have very similar challenges, very similar opportunities, and in many ways are aligned around many of our objectives and what we want to be able to achieve. We have a very similar history. We have a large diaspora who've gone to the US and to Canada, to Australia and New Zealand and so on. So there's lots of, I think, commonality in our objectives. I think having senior level representation, having substantive issues for discussion are all important. But one other thing I would say is this, that the focus tends to turn on to the BIC when things are failing. And in between times, if it happens at all, it happens at a very superficial level. At least that's the feeling. It was interesting at the conference around the Good Friday Agreement 25 that was hosted by Queen's University. One of the things that we drew out of that conference, and that a point that I made during the discussions, is that at times Northern Ireland benefits from a huge amount of input of energy, support, encouragement, collaboration, but it tends to be at points of crisis to get us over the hump. And then when we go back into government, everyone disappears and we're left to our own devices. And actually, government is the hard bit. For parties that have their politics aligned along institutional and ideological divisions that don't necessarily align with how we want to deliver education or healthcare or other things, governance day to day can be challenging. And I think that more support from both governments collectively, not to interfere with the decisions we make, but to ensure that we see the early warning signs of challenge, of conflict, and try to de-escalate that and try to find solutions to that, I think is a really important part of creating that stability that our reforms would aim to deliver. I think it has to be a bit of both.
Thank you.
Thank you, Robin. You've talked about your aspirations for reform of these institutions, which I think you described as being sort of set in aspic, and outlined a number of areas where that could happen, allowing one of the major parties to go into opposition, maybe the way the Speaker's elected, the way that some of those mechanisms work. And if you want to bring forward major constitutional change like that in a country like the United Kingdom, one of the parties can put it in their manifesto. So, we left the European Union because the Conservative Party called for a referendum. Keir Starmer's calling for reform of the House of Lords. And in coalition, we had the referendum on AV. I'm at a loss to see how the people in Northern Ireland can, through the way they cast their ballots, bring forward such a change, because we have two big parties who I don't think would support some of those changes, and therefore is it practical to expect that some of these changes could happen?
Well, I think first and foremost, yes, it's practical. I think secondly, these are not constitutional changes, to be clear. I am not an advocate and I'm not here to advocate for constitutional change. Constitutional position was settled in the Good Friday Agreement, that it's a matter for the people of Northern Ireland to decide whether they're in the UK or whether they're part of a united Ireland. And that will be a discussion and a debate that will continue, and a decision that will be taken by the people of Northern Ireland and indeed the people of Ireland as a whole. It's not one that I'm here to advocate for, and it isn't one that that is the one that drives my politics. What we're talking here about is reform of institutions, institutional improvements. It's not about reform of the fundamental principles of the Good Friday Agreement, nor is it about reform of the constitutional position of the institutions. It is simply about making them functional. And it was always envisaged that there would be change. There was meant to be a review of the Good Friday Agreement after 5 years, and it never actually happened in any meaningful way. We had a series of other diversionary talks and different things that happened, but we didn't have that fundamental review. The Assembly and Executive Review Committee, in fairness, which is an all-party committee in the Assembly, has reached the same conclusion, that we need to change these particular aspects of the agreement in order that the Assembly can work better. So there is consensus to the point that we recognise change is required. Where consensus starts to break down slightly is when that change would happen and what that change would look like. We have put forward very clear proposals from our perspective, and we have sought to engage with other parties around their views. So, for example, the Ulster Unionist Party have said that they believe that a commitment to look at those proposals should form part of any restoration package in terms of the Assembly and Executive, and they would be happy to sign up to that. The SDLP have their own proposals, which at some level there is commonality, and then at other parts they diverge. But there are areas around that with which we can find agreement. And ultimately, in terms of the public, every poll shows that the public want reform so that no single party can collapse the institutions. I think it would be hard to describe to people in Westminster the extent of public disaffection, frustration and anger with the current suspension coming on so quickly on the back of previous suspensions. There is a danger that if we do not proactively reform the Good Friday Agreement, we will allow it to die by 1,000 deaths, simply by repeated collapse. It will become so trivialised in the minds of the public that it will no longer have any credibility left. Now, I think it's much better for us to be open and honest and say we want reform and talk about how that reform sits, as we believe our proposals do, within the context of the parameters of the Good Friday Agreement. So not a complete throwing out of coalition government, not a complete throwing out of some form of mandatory coalition, not a complete throwing out of the protections for communities when it comes to voting, but an alteration of the mechanism. So, for example, parallel consent is not mentioned in the Good Friday Agreement itself, but it is in the legislation. It was one of a number of mechanisms that was envisaged for votes in the Assembly, but it was the one that was used and the only one that was used. There's no reason why you could not have cross-community votes, which were mentioned in the agreement, as weighted majority votes. That's minor reform as opposed to a throwing out of the Good Friday Agreement. It's a much more minimalist reform than we had in 2007 with St Andrews. And in many ways, it would create a stability that St Andrews, whilst that might have been the intention, failed to do. So I think we have to look also to both governments. There is a need for leadership in this, and sometimes Northern Ireland parties need government to show some leadership around what government wants, because remember, this is an international treaty. It isn't a plaything for the Northern Ireland political parties. It is an agreement, an international agreement between the UK and the Irish government, and they are the co-guarantors of that agreement. So it is also partly their responsibility to ensure that where it needs refreshed and reformed, to recognise democratic change and development and progress in society, that can be accommodated.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Certainly, you may be right that people this side of the water don't understand the frustrations and problems thrown up by the lack of a functioning executive, but certainly this committee understands very, very, very much those frustrations. So thank you very much indeed for your time, Naomi. You've always been a good friend to this kit, and we look forward to meeting you face to face maybe next time. Thank you.
Absolutely, and it was a pleasure to speak to you this morning. Thank you very much, Sir Rob.
Thank you. Order, order.
Proceeding has ended. The 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 proceeding has ended. ParliamentLive.tv. 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 ParliamentLive.tv.